The sun was setting over the idyllic, tree-lined streets of Birchwood Heights, a perfect suburban haven. The kind of place that felt like it belonged in a postcard, where families walked their dogs, kids played in front yards, and neighbors waved at each other from the comfort of their front porches. For Sarah and Mark Turner, it was the dream neighborhood. A fresh start. They had packed up their life from the city, tired of the noise, the chaos, and the never-ending rush. Birchwood Heights offered something quieter, something peaceful. Their new house was nestled on a corner lot, surrounded by a neat row of homes that all seemed to have been painted the same shade of beige, each with a perfectly manicured lawn. The Turners had already started making it their own. The kids had been running around in the backyard, while Sarah and Mark enjoyed a moment of peace on the front porch, sipping lemonade as they watched the evening sky turn a soft lavender. It was supposed to be perfect. But then there was her, Mrs. Gladys Wharton. No one had mentioned her when Sarah and Mark had first visited the neighborhood. No one had warned them that she was the eyes and ears of the HOA. No one had told them that she was always watching. It wasn't until a few days after they moved in that Sarah first noticed her, peering out from behind her curtain, her cold eyes scanning the street with the intensity of a hawk watching its prey. She was middle-aged, with a stern face and tightly coiled gray hair. Her house was on the opposite side of the street, just a few doors down, but it felt like she was always near, always watching, always judging. That evening, as Sarah and Mark unloaded the last of their boxes, she appeared at the end of their driveway, arms crossed, a disapproving frown on her face. "Hello, I'm Mrs. Wharton." She introduced herself, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "I'm sure you've received the HOA's welcome packet by now." Sarah was taken aback by the bluntness of her greeting. She nodded politely, offering a friendly smile. "Yes, thank you. It's all been very informative." Mrs. Wharton didn't smile back. "Good. I just wanted to remind you that the neighborhood values certain standards, and we take great pride in keeping things orderly." There was something chilling in her tone, a subtle warning embedded in her words. It was as if she was already sizing them up, gauging their worth as neighbors, as if the Turner family's every move would be scrutinized from that moment on. Sarah's eyes flicked to the driveway, where Mark had parked their cars. The tires of the sedan were barely over the line, not by much, just enough for the edge of the car to creep past the designated space. But that was enough for Mrs. Wharton. Her sharp eyes had already caught the mistake, and she was quick to make her disapproval known. "You'll need to move your car," she said crisply. "We have strict guidelines about driveway placement here. You wouldn't want a violation, would you?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Violation. It seemed ridiculous, overparking a few inches, but the sternness in Mrs. Wharton's voice made her second-guess herself. The woman stood there, unwavering, her gaze never leaving the driveway, as if the very act of parking in such a manner was an unforgivable sin. "We'll take care of it," Mark said, forcing a smile, trying to brush off the tension. But Mrs. Wharton wasn't done. "There's also the matter of your lawn," she continued, her eyes flicking briefly to the patch of grass in front of their house. "It's a bit unkempt. I suggest you get that trimmed before the next inspection." And just like that, with her words, Mrs. Wharton had planted a seed of unease in their minds. This wasn't going to be the peaceful neighborhood they had imagined. This was a place where every action, every inch of space, would be scrutinized. The walls of their new home suddenly felt smaller, more oppressive, as if they were already being washed. As Mrs. Wharton turned and walked back to her house, Sarah's eyes lingered on the neatly manicured lawns of their neighbors. They were all perfect, too perfect. And as the door clicked shut behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. This wasn't just about a few rules. No, this was about control. And the Turner family had unknowingly stepped into a war they hadn't signed up for. The next morning, the Turner family woke up to what should have been the beginning of a relaxing weekend in their new home. The sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, casting warm golden rays across the living room. Sarah and Mark shared a quiet moment over coffee, discussing plans for the yard and the upcoming housewarming party. The kids, blissfully unaware of the tensions growing just beyond the front door, played in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the still air. But the peaceful atmosphere didn't last. By mid-morning, a crisp envelope appeared in the Turner family's mailbox. It was the same shade of white as the neighborhood's perfectly trimmed hedges, the kind that blended into the sea of uniformity that seemed to surround them. Sarah noticed it first as she walked out to grab the mail. The moment she saw the bold, official-looking HOA insignia, a knot twisted in her stomach. It was too soon, wasn't it? With a deep breath, she tore it open, scanning the letter. At first, her eyes couldn't quite comprehend what they were seeing. There it was, printed in cold, sterile font. First notice: violation of property guidelines. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the details. Improper parking. Vehicle extending beyond driveway boundary. The words felt like a slap across the face. She had noticed the slight misalignment the night before, but it was a few inches, hardly worth the fuss. And yet, here it was, a formal reprimand from the HOA, delivered with clinical precision. Mark appeared beside her, a confused look crossing his face as he read over her shoulder. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It's just a car, for God's sake. They're acting like we've committed a crime." Sarah frowned, feeling the weight of the situation settle over her. She had hoped it would all blow over, maybe a warning or a simple reminder. But no, Mrs. Wharton's grip on the neighborhood was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The letter went on, detailing that the violation needed to be corrected immediately, or a fine would be issued. Sarah's mind raced. A fine? For a few inches. "I'll call the HOA office," Mark said, his tone flat, the edge of frustration creeping into his voice. "This is ridiculous." As Mark dialed the number, Sarah stepped outside, her eyes scanning the street. It looked so peaceful, so perfect. Every house was immaculate, the lawns freshly mowed, the driveways free of any imperfection. Mrs. Wharton's house, just across the street, stood like a monument to orderliness, every detail carefully calculated to match the ideal of suburban perfection. But as Sarah's gaze lingered on her neighbor's house, she noticed something unsettling. Mrs. Wharton was standing in her front window, watching. Sarah could feel her eyes, sharp and unblinking, piercing through the glass like a hawk observing its prey. A chill ran down her spine, but she tried to shake it off. It was just her imagination, right? Or was it? The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as she turned back to the house, where Mark was finishing his call with the HOA office. When he hung up, his face was grim. "They won't budge," he said quietly. "We have to park our cars perfectly, or they'll fine us. And if we keep getting notices, it could escalate." "Escalate," Sarah repeated, the word feeling heavier than she expected. How? What could they do? Send the police for parking a few inches over the line? Mark didn't answer right away. He was staring out the window, watching Mrs. Wharton move back and forth in her front yard, her eyes never leaving their property. Something about the way she moved made Sarah uneasy, like a predator sensing weakness. "I don't know," Mark said, his voice low. "But I'm not going to let them bully us. Not over something this petty." He turned and walked out the door, heading for the driveway, but Sarah remained rooted in place. The unease that had settled in her chest only grew, tightening like a knot. This wasn't just about rules or parking violations. This was personal. Mrs. Wharton's eyes on them, the way she hovered just outside their lives. It was like she was waiting for them to slip up. And as Sarah stood there, staring out at the perfect lawn and the perfect houses, she couldn't shake the feeling that the calm she'd hoped for was nothing more than the eye of the storm. The real chaos was just beginning. Mrs. Wharton had already made her move, and it was clear now. She wasn't going to stop until the Turners were forced to obey. The days that followed felt like a pressure cooker slowly turning up the heat. Sarah and Mark tried to keep their heads down, but it became impossible to ignore the ever-present tension in the air. Mrs. Wharton's eyes were everywhere. From her porch, from her window, from her perfectly manicured garden. She was always watching, her unblinking gaze a constant reminder that the peace of their new home came at a steep price. Each morning, Sarah noticed something new. Their mailbox wasn't perfectly aligned with the others, or their garden gnomes were placed just a little too far to the left. Little things that should have been inconsequential, seemed to irritate Mrs. Wharton in ways Sarah couldn't understand. It was as if she was waiting for any small misstep to pounce on, and when they finally did make one, she'd strike with the ferocity of a shark smelling blood in the water. One afternoon, Sarah went to the mailbox, only to find another violation notice waiting for her. This one wasn't about the driveway. No, Mrs. Wharton had moved on to their lawn. Violation: lawn height exceeds 4 inches. Immediate correction required. Sarah's stomach sank. She glanced at their front yard. The grass was slightly overgrown, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. It didn't even seem that bad compared to the neighbors' lawns. Her mind raced. Was this really about the grass, or was it just another excuse for Mrs. Wharton to flex her power? She showed the letter to Mark when he got home, and he threw up his hands in frustration. This is ridiculous. Our lawn looks fine. It's not like we're letting it turn into a jungle. Maybe not to you, Sarah said, but it's not just the lawn, Mark. She's making everything an issue. They discussed it for hours that evening, debating whether to take the bait and fix everything according to Mrs. Wharton's demands, or to fight back. The idea of fighting felt appealing. But the question that lingered was this: how far was Mrs. Wharton willing to push? The next day, Sarah was in the front yard, trimming the grass, trying to comply with yet another one of Mrs. Wharton's endless demands, when she saw it. The faintest shadow in the corner of her eye. Mrs. Wharton was standing at the edge of her driveway, just beyond the line of trees that separated their properties. She was holding something in her hand. A clipboard, maybe a notebook, and her gaze was laser-focused on Sarah, her lips barely moving as she muttered something under her breath. Sarah froze. She couldn't help herself. Her heart started to race, and she felt an uncomfortable knot form in her stomach. Was she being watched again? And if so, what was Mrs. Wharton writing down this time? The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker, palpable, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Mark came out just then, his voice breaking through the tension. "Are you okay?" Sarah quickly turned to him, a forced smile on her face. "Yeah. She cut herself off, then gestured vaguely to Mrs. Wharton across the street. "She's watching us again. It's like she's waiting for something to go wrong." Mark's expression hardened. "She's been pushing us for days. This isn't about grass or a driveway anymore. This is her power trip." But before they could say anything more, Mrs. Wharton began to walk across her lawn toward them, her steps deliberate and slow. Sarah's heart raced. Was this the moment where things would escalate again? Mrs. Wharton stopped just a few feet from their driveway, her arms crossed. Her presence was overpowering, and the smile on her face was cold, calculating. "I trust you're taking care of that lawn issue." "We're working on it," Sarah said, forcing herself to remain calm, though every muscle in her body was taut with anxiety. "But I think it's fine, don't you?" Mrs. Wharton didn't respond right away. Instead, she tilted her head, eyes narrowing as she looked at Sarah, almost as though she were measuring her. The air between them crackled with something dangerous, something deeper than a simple disagreement about lawn height. "I'm afraid the HOA doesn't see it as fine," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "And if you don't comply, well, there are consequences." The way she said it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It wasn't just about the grass. It wasn't just about the parking. Mrs. Wharton was playing a different game now, one with higher stakes. "You've already sent us 2 violation notices," Mark said, stepping forward, his tone sharp. "What's next? Are you going to fine us for the color of our door, or how we arrange our trash cans?" Mrs. Wharton's lips curled into a thin smile. "I'm just trying to ensure that this neighborhood remains what it was intended to be." "Perfect. If you're not interested in following the rules, then maybe you're not meant to live here after all." Her words hung in the air like a dark cloud, ominous and heavy. And just like that, it was clear. This was no longer just about rules. Mrs. Wharton wasn't interested in just maintaining order. She was waging a quiet war, and the Turners were caught in her crosshairs. They had no idea yet, but the real battle for their home had just begun. The storm was brewing, and they were standing right in the eye of it. It was early evening when Sarah stepped outside to check the mailbox once more. The air had shifted, cooler, but with a lingering tension that refused to dissipate. She could feel the weight of it as she walked to the curb, her footsteps slow and measured, as though she were moving through thick fog. The houses on Birchwood Heights were quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Yet it felt as though something was on the verge of breaking. As she reached the mailbox, she found what she had been dreading. Another letter. But this time, it wasn't just a violation notice. It was something worse, a final warning. Her fingers clenched around the paper as she unfolded it. The words leaped off the page. "Immediate action required. Cease all non-compliance with HOA standards or face legal action." Her heart hammered in her chest as she read the rest of the letter. It was clear. The HOA, with Mrs. Wharton at its helm, was not backing down. The family had a choice to make: complied fully with every demand, or face fines, court hearings, and possibly being forced out of the neighborhood. Sarah's mind spun, her thoughts racing. How had it come to this? As she made her way back to the house, the sensation of being cornered tightened around her. Her hands trembled as she entered through the front door, holding up the letter for Mark to see. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're threatening us now." Mark's face darkened as he read the letter. "We can't just keep letting them walk all over us." His voice was tight with frustration. "She's turned this whole neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. I'm not going to keep living like this. We need to do something about it." "I agree," Sarah replied, her mind already racing with possibilities. "But if we push back too hard, we could lose everything. The fines, the lawsuits, we could lose the house. But if we keep letting her dictate our lives, she's just going to keep pushing until we have nothing left." Mark countered, his voice rising slightly in anger. "I'm tired of playing by her rules." The decision weighed heavily on them both. There was no middle ground anymore, no more waiting for things to settle on their own. The Turner family was caught in the middle of a war for control, a war that they had not started, but were now forced to fight. And as the day wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was lurking just beneath the surface. Mrs. Wharton wasn't just enforcing rules, she was orchestrating an attack. The violation notices, the threats, the cold, calculating way she moved through the neighborhood. It all felt deliberate. And Sarah was beginning to realize that their small rebellion was more than just a matter of principles. It was a challenge to Mrs. Wharton's authority. The next morning, Sarah and Mark decided to take action, each of them feeling the gravity of the decision they were about to make. They began working in the yard, trimming the grass to the exact measurements Mrs. Wharton had dictated, repainting the mailbox to match the precise shade of brown that was appropriate. But as they worked, a strange sense of unease crept over them. The neighbors, once friendly faces, were now nowhere to be found. No one walked by. No one waved. The streets felt more isolated than ever before, and the pressure of knowing that Mrs. Wharton was always watching, always waiting for a mistake, grew unbearable. It was then, as Sarah placed the final brushstroke of paint on the mailbox, that she heard the sound, the unmistakable clack of Mrs. Wharton's heels on the pavement. She turned slowly to see her walking down the street, clipboard in hand, her eyes cold and piercing. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She simply walked toward them, her every step a deliberate reminder of who held the power in this neighborhood. "I see you've done your duty," Mrs. Wharton said, her voice dripping with condescension. But don't think this will be enough. You've made a habit of ignoring the rules, and that won't go unpunished." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment that would set the stage for everything that came next. "I'm afraid we're done being bullied," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You've gone too far, Mrs. Wharton. We're not going to play by your rules anymore." Mrs. Wharton's lips twisted into a thin smile, her eyes narrowing with a coldness that sent a chill through Sarah. "Oh, you think you're done with me? Don't be so sure. This is just the beginning. You won't win. Not here. Not in my neighborhood." The words hit harder than Sarah expected, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of Mrs. Wharton's power. But there was no turning back now. The line had been crossed, and the fight had officially begun. As Mrs. Wharton turned and walked back toward her house, Sarah felt a strange, unsettling sense of foreboding settle over her. This was no longer about parking tickets or lawn height. Mrs. Wharton had declared war, and Sarah and Mark were now trapped in the crossfire. The storm that had been brewing was about to break, and nothing would ever be the same again. The real battle was only just starting. The following days felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Every morning, Sarah would wake up to check the mailbox, hoping, praying, that the latest threat from Mrs. Wharton or the HOA wouldn't arrive. But they always did, each more aggressive than the last. The notices had escalated, from violations to fines, and now Sarah and Mark were facing the very real possibility of a lawsuit. Sarah couldn't escape the growing sense of being trapped. Each small step they took to stand up to Mrs. Wharton seemed to push them further into her web. Their neighbors had stopped speaking to them, avoiding eye contact as they passed. The neighborhood, once warm and welcoming, now felt like a battlefield, every house an enemy stronghold. The Turners were alone in this fight. Late one night, after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah sat in the kitchen, scrolling through the latest email from the HOA. It was a notice of a mandatory neighborhood meeting, called by none other than Mrs. Wharton herself. The email was vague, only that the agenda would include discussions about the future of Birchwood Heights and compliance issues. Sarah tossed her phone down with a frustrated sigh. "She's got everyone under her thumb," she muttered to herself. "But not us. Not anymore." Mark, who had been pacing the living room, stopped. "We need to take control. If we keep going at her like this, it's just going to keep getting worse. We need to outsmart her." His words hit Sarah like a spark to dry tinder. Outsmart her. It was the perfect strategy. Mrs. Wharton thrived on control, on predictability. She was a puppet master, pulling strings to make sure the neighborhood conformed to her idea of perfection. But what if they could turn the tables? What if they could make Mrs. Wharton's own obsession with rules her downfall? "We need to expose her," Sarah said, her voice sharp with determination. "She's been using the HOA to control everyone. But what if she's breaking the rules herself?" Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You think she's not as perfect as she seems?" "Uncertain of it," Sarah replied. "We've been so focused on defending ourselves. But maybe it's time to go on the offense." The plan was simple. Dig into Mrs. Wharton's background. Find any weaknesses, any violations, any dirt that they could use to turn the tables. It was risky, but at this point, they had nothing left to lose. The HOA was closing in on them, and they needed leverage, something to take the power away from Mrs. Wharton and give it back to the people of Birchwood Heights. For the next few days, Sarah and Mark split their efforts. Sarah began researching the HOA's bylaws, scouring the fine print for any rules that Mrs. Wharton might have violated in her relentless campaign of control. Meanwhile, Mark took to social media, carefully combing through the neighborhood groups for any gossip or complaints about Mrs. Wharton's behavior. It wasn't long before Sarah found something, a discrepancy in the HOA's records. Mrs. Wharton had been filing emergency violations that weren't even in the official guidelines. There were also rumors of financial mismanagement within the HOA, something that had been quietly brushed under the rug for years. Mrs. Wharton's obsession with perfection was a facade, a cover for something much darker. And then, just when Sarah thought they were getting close to finding a real smoking gun, the unexpected happened. Mark came home one afternoon with a strange expression on his face. "I talked to a few of the old-timers at the hardware store today," he said slowly, as if weighing his words. Apparently, Mrs. Wharton wasn't always the way she is now. She wasn't always in charge of the HOA either. Sarah's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What happened?" "Well," Mark continued, "before she started running the HOA, she was just another housewife. But there was a lot of drama surrounding her rise to power. Some people think she's been making up her own rules for years, twisting the HOA's guidelines to fit her agenda." Sarah felt a rush of adrenaline. "That's it. If we can prove she's been bending the rules, maybe we can finally turn the tide." The next day, Sarah and Mark met with a few neighbors who were still willing to talk to them, those who hadn't yet been intimidated by Mrs. Wharton's rule. One of them, an older man named Jerry, confirmed what Mark had heard. "She wasn't elected, you know. She just took over after the last HOA president mysteriously stepped down. No one really knows why. But she's been running the place like a dictatorship ever since." The pieces were falling into place. Mrs. Wharton had manipulated the system to rise to power, using fear and intimidation to keep everyone in line. But her reign had left cracks that the Turners could exploit. That night, as Sarah and Mark sat in the living room, going over their findings, a dark sense of satisfaction washed over them. They had the ammunition they needed. They had the truth. The only question now was how far they were willing to go to bring down Mrs. Wharton's empire, and what the consequences might be when they did. Because they knew one thing for sure. They had just crossed a line. The days before the neighborhood meeting felt like a fragile silence before an impending storm. Every step Sarah and Mark took felt like a calculated move in a dangerous game. They had gathered their evidence, connected the dots, and prepared themselves for the confrontation they knew was coming. But despite their resolve, a lingering sense of dread gnawed at the back of their minds. They were going to expose Mrs. Wharton, but what would happen when the truth came to light? Would the rest of the neighborhood back them up, or would they find themselves even more isolated than before? As the meeting drew closer, the Turners couldn't help but notice the growing tension in the air. People in the neighborhood had started to whisper, casting furtive glances at Sarah and Mark whenever they passed. It was as if the entire community was holding its breath, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was clear. Mrs. Wharton's iron grip on Birchwood Heights was loosening, and it terrified her. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. It was being held in the community center, a place that had once been a symbol of unity, but now felt more like the site of an impending battle. Sarah and Mark arrived early, their nerves tight, but their resolve stronger than ever. As they entered the room, they saw familiar faces, the neighbors who had grown distant, the ones who still hadn't chosen sides. And of course, Mrs. Wharton. She was already at the front, clipboard in hand, her smile cold and calculating as she surveyed the room. "Ah, the Turners," Mrs. Wharton's voice rang out, laced with mock sweetness. "I'm so glad you could join us tonight. I'm sure you have some interesting things to say." Sarah's jaw clenched, but she held her ground, taking a seat near the back. Mark's hand brushed hers, a silent gesture of solidarity. It was time to face down the woman who had tormented them for weeks. The meeting began, and Mrs. Wharton wasted no time in launching into her usual spiel. Rules, regulations, more rules, and a stern warning about upholding the values of Birchwood Heights. Sarah's stomach twisted. This was the moment she had been dreading. Mrs. Wharton's voice had that familiar edge to it, the tone of someone used to controlling everything around them. But Sarah could feel the weight of the room shift. People were no longer hanging on her every word. They were waiting for someone to break the silence, to challenge her. And then, when Mrs. Wharton took a breath and looked down at her notes, Sarah stood up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady, but carrying. I think it's time we talked about what's been going on in this neighborhood for the last few months." The room grew still. Every eye was on Sarah now, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of their attention pressing down on her. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. We've all been living under a cloud of fear and intimidation. Mrs. Wharton has been using the HOA to manipulate us, to push her own agenda, and punish anyone who dares to stand up to her. Sarah continued, her voice rising with every word. "But I have proof that she's been breaking the very rules she's forced all of us to follow." Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Wharton's face hardened, her smile fading into something more dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Wharton replied, her voice low and controlled, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. Sarah pulled out the documents she had gathered, the violation notices, the inconsistencies in the HOA records, and the rumors about Mrs. Wharton's rise to power. She placed them on the table for everyone to see. "I've done my research," Sarah said. "I've found violations that were never filed, discrepancies in the HOA's financial records, and most importantly, Mrs. Wharton didn't even legally take control of this association. She manipulated the system to get where she is." The room was silent, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. Mrs. Wharton's eyes flickered with a flash of anger, but she quickly masked it with a forced chuckle. "Is this how it's going to be, Turner?" Mrs. Wharton sneered. "You think you can just slander my name and tear down everything I've worked for? You don't know what you're dealing with." But Sarah wasn't finished. "This isn't about tearing you down, Mrs. Wharton," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is about taking back control of our neighborhood. We don't need a tyrant ruling over us. We need someone who will listen to the people, not use them as pawns in a game of power." Mark stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor. "We're not backing down anymore. The truth is out, and it's time for a change." The room was still, but something had shifted. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd. People exchanged uncertain glances, the atmosphere charged with uncertainty. It was no longer just a confrontation between Sarah and Mrs. Wharton. It was a turning point for everyone in Birchwood Heights. They were beginning to see the cracks in the foundation of the perfect neighborhood Mrs. Wharton had built, and those cracks were widening by the second. But as Sarah looked around, she realized something. The storm had only just begun. Mrs. Wharton was not going to surrender quietly. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And with that thought, Sarah knew that what lay ahead was far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Mrs. Wharton's wrath was coming. But they were ready. They had no choice. The meeting room buzzed with a nervous energy that Sarah couldn't shake. People were talking in hushed tones, exchanging wary glances as if they were waiting for a signal to either stand by or retreat. Sarah stood tall, her pulse racing as she watched Mrs. Wharton, who was now seething with barely contained fury. She hadn't expected this kind of response. She had underestimated Sarah's resolve. But Sarah knew that Mrs. Wharton wasn't a woman to back down so easily. The storm was far from over. For a moment, Mrs. Wharton said nothing, her sharp eyes flicking over the documents Sarah had presented. The air felt thick, oppressive. Then, as if to break the silence, Mrs. Wharton straightened up and, with unnerving calm, addressed the room. "You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy," she began, her voice cool and calculated. "But what you don't understand is that the rules are the rules. They protect us. They protect this neighborhood. You may think you found something to exploit, but let me remind you, violating the HOA code comes with consequences. Serious consequences." Her words hung in the air, and Sarah could feel a chill creeping up her spine. Mrs. Wharton's gaze, cold as ice, fixed on her. "Did you really think you could stand here and accuse me of these things without repercussions? You have no idea what you're dealing with." A shiver of fear twisted in Sarah's stomach, but she refused to back down. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm exposing the truth." The room shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. No one knew what would come next. Mrs. Wharton, The puppet master who had controlled Birchwood Heights for so long was now cornered, and Sarah had no intention of letting her slip away. Then, without warning, Mrs. Wharton's demeanor changed. Her cold expression melted into a calculated, almost predatory smile. "I suggest you reconsider your position," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with false kindness. "You're making a grave mistake, Sarah. A very grave mistake." For a split second, Sarah felt the full force of Mrs. Wharton's gaze, and it sent a chill down her spine. Something told her this wasn't just a matter of losing control, it was personal. Mrs. Wharton wasn't going to let this slide. The meeting continued, but Sarah couldn't shake the sense of unease gnawing at her. Her mind raced with possibilities. What was Mrs. Wharton planning? How far would she go to protect her power? Sarah glanced at Mark, who stood beside her, his face grim but resolute. They both knew this wasn't over. After the meeting, as Sarah and Mark made their way back to their car, they noticed something odd. The streets that had once felt so familiar now seemed darker, as if the neighborhood had changed overnight. The once friendly faces that had waved at them in passing now looked away, avoiding their gaze. It was as though a silent agreement had been made. Mark clenched his jaw. "We've done it now. She's not going to let us get away with this." "I know it," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "But we can't stop now. We've got to push forward. We have the truth on our side." Just as they got into the car, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, but when she did, her blood ran cold. "You've made a terrible mistake. I suggest you drop this now, before things get worse. You have no idea what you've unleashed. Consider this your final warning." The message was short, but its implications were clear. Someone, likely Mrs. Wharton's supporters, had sent it, a thinly veiled threat. Sarah's hand shook as she lowered the phone. Her gut twisted with dread. Mark turned to her, his face pale. "That message, it's her, isn't it?" Sarah nodded grimly. "She's not going to let us win. But I'm not backing down." The rest of the evening was a blur, as Sarah and Mark sat in their living room, discussing their next steps. They knew that they couldn't trust anyone anymore. The neighborhood, once a symbol of suburban serenity, was now a powder keg ready to explode. Every neighbor, every face they passed on the street, could be an ally or an enemy. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, there was a knock on the door. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as Mark stood and walked to answer it. When he opened the door, there was no one there, but a small, neatly folded piece of paper lay on the doorstep. Mark picked it up and unfolded it, his face turning pale as he read the message aloud. "This is your last chance. The next time you cross me, you'll regret it. I always get what I want. Consider yourself warned." The message was short, ruthless, and it sent a clear signal. Mrs. Wharton was done playing games. The web had tightened, and now there was no escape. Sarah's stomach dropped. They had pushed her too far, and Mrs. Wharton was preparing for a counterattack. It was no longer about rules or bylaws. It was personal. The battle had crossed a line, and in this game, there would be no easy victory. As Sarah stared at the message in her hand, she realized the terrifying truth. They had underestimated the depths of Mrs. Wharton's power. And now, it was a fight for their lives. The days that followed were a blur of tension. Sarah and Mark barely slept, constantly on edge. Each knock at the door, each rustling outside their window, sent their hearts racing. It felt as though Mrs. Wharton's shadow was constantly looming over them, her wrath a tangible force ready to strike at any moment. But they couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything they had uncovered. The final showdown was looming, and Sarah could feel it in her bones. They had gone too far. They had exposed Mrs. Wharton's secrets, but the woman was relentless. She would never allow herself to be brought down so easily. She had too much power, too many strings to pull. Sarah had seen the way Mrs. Wharton manipulated the neighborhood, turned friends into enemies, made everyone fear her. But now, The tide had turned. The storm was coming, and no one would be spared. That night, after another threatening message left on their doorstep, Sarah and Mark made a decision. It was time to end it. They had no choice but to expose Mrs. Wharton for what she truly was: a fraud. The time for secrecy and subterfuge had passed. It was now or never. They gathered their evidence, everything they had painstakingly collected over the past few weeks: the forged violation notices, the discrepancies in the HOA's finances, the shady backdoor dealings, the rumors of Mrs. Wharton's rise to power. It was all there, laid bare in black and white. But they needed more. They needed something that would make the community believe them, something undeniable. And that's when it hit Sarah. There was one person who could blow this whole thing wide open: the former HOA president, the one who had mysteriously stepped down, clearing the way for Mrs. Wharton's rise to power. No one knew the full story, but Sarah had a gut feeling that this man held the final piece of the puzzle. The next morning, Sarah and Mark drove to the old man's house. They didn't know what to expect. He might not even be willing to speak to them. But as they knocked on his door, Sarah felt a strange sense of hope. The man who had once been in charge of Birchwood Heights might just be the key to dismantling Mrs. Wharton's empire. An elderly man, thin and weathered, opened the door. He looked at them with cautious curiosity. "We're here to talk about Mrs. Wharton," Sarah began, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to know what happened to you. Why did you step down from the HOA?" The old man hesitated, then stepped aside to let them in. His home was modest, the walls lined with pictures of a life well lived, but there was something in his eyes, something haunted. He sat them down and leaned forward, his voice low. "Mrs. Wharton didn't just take over the HOA. She forced me out. She blackmailed me. She had dirt on me. And she made sure I couldn't stay. She promised things would get better, that she could control the neighborhood. But things only got worse. She's been running things behind the scenes, twisting the rules, threatening people. You've only scratched the surface." It was the confirmation Sarah had been waiting for. Mrs. Wharton's reign wasn't just about control. It was built on lies, manipulation, and threats. The former HOA president spoke of shady deals, backroom negotiations, and a network of people Mrs. Wharton had silenced with fear. As Sarah and Mark left the old man's house, they knew what they had to do. They had the truth. They had the key to bringing Mrs. Wharton's empire crashing down. The final HOA meeting was set for the following week. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah and Mark made their way into the community center once again. But this time, they weren't going in as victims. They weren't going in afraid. This time, they were going in to finish what they had started. Mrs. Wharton was already at the front of the room, her smile a thin veneer of confidence, but Sarah could see the crack in her armor. She was no longer in control. The people in the room, some of them her staunch supporters, others wavering, could sense it too. The storm had arrived. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice steady and resolute. "You all know the story Mrs. Wharton has fed you," Sarah began. "The story of a perfect neighborhood, where rules and regulations are sacred. But I've uncovered the truth. This perfect neighborhood is a facade. Mrs. Wharton has been running the HOA with one goal in mind: control. And she's used fear, manipulation, and even blackmail to keep us all in line." Gasps filled the room, but Sarah continued. "I've spoken to the former HOA president. He was forced out, his life ruined, all because he stood in her way. I've seen the records. I've heard the whispers. Mrs. Wharton isn't the leader you think she is. She's a tyrant." Mark stood beside her, holding up the documents they had gathered, proof of Mrs. Wharton's crimes. The room was silent for a beat, the tension crackling in the air. And then, to Sarah's shock, something incredible happened. One by one, neighbors began to speak up. "It's true," said Jerry, the old-timer who had warned them about Mrs. Wharton's rise. "I've seen it too. She's been running things for years, and it's been nothing but trouble." People stood. Others nodded. A collective wave of realization swept through the room. Mrs. Wharton's empire had shattered, piece by piece. She stood up, her face twisted in fury, but it was too late. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. As the room erupted in heated discussion, Mrs. Wharton tried to speak, but her voice was drowned out by the chorus of voices that now demanded accountability. In the end, it wasn't just Mrs. Wharton's power that crumbled, it was the fear that had held Birchwood Heights in check for so long. The reign of terror had ended, and the neighborhood was free. Free to rebuild, free to speak, free to live without the suffocating grip of one woman's obsession with control. As Sarah and Mark stood there, surrounded by the people who had once been their enemies, they realized that they had done it. They had taken down the villain. And in doing so, they had given the neighborhood back to the people. But more than that, they had given themselves back their lives. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.